The chains were heavy. They pressed into the skin of Daniel Hayes like cold fingers that would not let go. He knelt in the dirt of the slave market with his head down and his hands bound in front of him. The dust smelled like blood and fear. He had learned that smell well in the past 3 weeks. Around him, hundreds of slaves from a dozen different worlds waited for their turn on the auction block. Some cried. Some prayed to gods that had not answered. Some just stared at nothing with empty eyes. Daniel did none of these things. He watched. He listened. He remembered, 3 years ago, he had been the first officer aboard the exploration vessel Starlight Horizon. It was a good ship with a good crew. 42 men and women who had signed up to explore the edges of known space. They had found new planets. They had mapped new stars. They had believed they were safe. They were wrong. The Valkorians had come out of nowhere near the Kepler Passage. Their warships were fast and brutal. The attack lasted less than an hour. When it was over, 42 crew members were dead. The 17 survivors were put in chains and taken to the Outer Rim to be sold. Daniel had watched his friends die. He had watched his captain take a plasma bolt to the chest while trying to protect the bridge. He had watched the communications officer, a young woman named Amy, get dragged away screaming. He did not know if she was still alive. He did not know if any of them were still alive. All he knew was that he was here now, kneeling in the dirt, waiting to be sold like an animal. The Valkorians were tall creatures that looked like wolves standing on 2 legs. They had silver fur and amber eyes that glowed in certain light. Their teeth were sharp. Their claws were sharper. They ruled this part of the galaxy through fear and violence. And they saw other species as nothing more than tools to be used and thrown away. A Valkorian slaver walked down the line of prisoners, checking each one like a farmer checking livestock. He stopped in front of Daniel and grabbed his chin, forcing his head up. "Human," the slaver said. His voice was deep and rough. "Young, strong, good teeth. He will sell well." Daniel said nothing. He had learned not to speak unless spoken to. He had learned that lesson with bruises and blood. The slaver moved on. Daniel let out a slow breath and went back to watching. The auction began at midday. Slaves were brought up one by one and sold to the highest bidder. The Chitauri went first. They were insect-like creatures with 4 arms and hard shells. They were good for mining, the auctioneer said. They could work in places where others would die. Then came the Dranathi. They were scaled beings with long tails and clever hands. They were good for detailed work, building things, fixing things. Then came the humans. Daniel was the 3rd human to be sold that day. They dragged him up onto the wooden platform and made him stand while the crowd looked at him. The auctioneer spoke in a language Daniel did not fully understand, but he caught enough words: strong, healthy, obedient. That last word was a lie. Daniel was not obedient. He was just smart enough to pretend. The bidding started low but climbed quickly. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy, and rarity meant value. Several Valkorian nobles raised their hands, calling out numbers that meant nothing to Daniel. He did not care who bought him. They were all the same. They were all monsters. In the end, a Valkorian in expensive robes won the auction. He was tall even for his kind, with fur that had gone gray around the muzzle and eyes that held no warmth at all. His name, Daniel would later learn, was Overlord Kraeth. He ruled a small moon called Varos 7, and he had a reputation for breaking slaves the way other beings broke bread. They put Daniel in a transport ship with 11 other new purchases. The journey to Varos 7 took 2 days. During that time, Daniel did not sleep. He sat in the corner of the cargo hold with his back against the wall and his eyes on the door. He listened to the other slaves talk in whispers about what awaited them. None of the stories were good. When the ship landed, they were marched out into pale sunlight. Varos 7 was a cold world with purple skies and fields of strange grain that stretched to the horizon. Hundreds of slaves worked those fields, their backs bent under the weight of their labor. Daniel saw Chitauri, Dranathi, and even a handful of other humans. They did not look up as the new arrivals passed. They had learned not to look at anything but the ground. The estate of Overlord Kraeth was massive. The main house was a fortress of black stone with towers that reached toward the sky like claws. Smaller buildings surrounded it. Barracks for the guards. Quarters for the slaves. Processing facilities where the grain was turned into the alcohol that the Volcorians loved so much. Daniel was taken to a small room where a Volcorian overseer looked him over. This one was even bigger than Kraeth, with scars on his muzzle and one ear that had been torn in half. His name was Torak, and he was in charge of discipline. "You are property now," Torak said. He spoke slowly, making sure Daniel understood every word. "You have no name. You have no rights. You exist to work and to serve. If you work hard, you will be fed. If you serve well, you will not be beaten. If you cause trouble, you will suffer. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded. "Say it, I understand." Torak smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "Good, take him to the fields." They gave Daniel rough clothes and a pair of worn boots. They put a metal collar around his neck with a small device that would shock him if he tried to run. Then they sent him to work. The first day was the hardest. The grain was heavy and the tools were crude. Daniel's hands bled. His back ached. By sunset he could barely stand. But he did not complain. He did not cry. He worked until they told him to stop. And then he walked to the slave quarters and found an empty corner to sleep in. On his second day he met the other humans. There were 4 of them on this part of the estate. They had been here for years, some of them for decades. Their eyes were hollow. Their spirits were broken. They told Daniel to keep his head down and do what he was told. Fighting back only made things worse. Daniel listened. He nodded. He said nothing on his 3rd day. Everything changed. He was working in the fields when he saw an old Chitauri woman stumble and fall. She was small and frail, her shell cracked in several places. She had been working since before sunrise, and her body simply gave out. Torak was there in seconds. He raised his whip and brought it down on the old woman with terrible force. She screamed. The sound was high and thin, like glass breaking. Daniel did not think. He moved. He stepped between the whip and the woman. The blow meant for her struck him across the chest instead. Pain exploded through his body, but he did not move. He stood there, his eyes locked on Torak, his jaw set hard. The entire field went silent. No one had ever done this before. No one had ever dared. Torak stared at Daniel for a long moment. Then he smiled that same cold smile. "Take him," he said to the guards. "Bring him to the courtyard at sunset. The whole household will watch." They dragged Daniel away. The old Chitauri woman looked at him with something he had not seen in a long time, gratitude and fear. She knew what was coming. They all did, but Daniel did not regret what he had done. Some things were worth the pain. The sun was setting over Varro 7 when they brought Daniel to the courtyard. The sky had turned from purple to deep red, like a bruise spreading across the heavens. The air was cold, and Daniel could see his breath forming. Small clouds in front of his face. The courtyard was a wide open space in the center of the estate. At its heart stood a metal post that had been worn smooth by decades of use. Dark stains covered the ground around it. Daniel did not need to ask what those stains were. He knew. Guards dragged him forward and chained his wrist to rings set high on the post. The metal was cold against his skin. He had to stand on his toes to keep his arms from being pulled too tight. They tore his shirt away, leaving his back bare to the evening air. The entire household had been summoned to watch. Slaves stood in rows along the edges of the courtyard, their heads bowed, their eyes carefully looking anywhere but at Daniel. Guards lined the walls with weapons ready, just in case anyone got any ideas. Servants stood near the main house, watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to cruel amusement, and on a raised platform near the front. The family of Overlord Kraeth took their seats. Kraeth himself sat in the center, his gray fur almost white in the fading light. His mate Selith sat beside him, a tall female with pale silver fur and cold eyes. She looked at Daniel the way someone might look at a bug that had crawled into their food. Around them sat their 4 cubs. The oldest was Draith, a young male who had recently entered adulthood. He was big and strong, with the same cruel eyes as his father. He leaned forward in his seat, eager to watch the punishment. Next was Korvax, a few years younger than his brother, but just as mean. He was laughing and making jokes with Draith about how loud the human would scream. Then came Yanara, the only daughter. She was beautiful by Valkorian standards, with pure white fur and a bored expression. She looked at her claws while they prepared Daniel for the whip, as if this was all too common to be interesting. And finally, sitting at the very end of the row, was the smallest cub. Her name was Veka. She was barely 4 cycles old, which made her about the size of a human toddler. Though her species grew faster in mind than in body, her fur was darker than her siblings, almost gray, and one of her ears flopped slightly to the side. She was clearly the runt of the family, small and quiet and easy to overlook. But her eyes were different from the others. They were not cruel. They were not bored. They watched everything with a sharp attention that seemed too old for such a young face. Torak stepped forward with the whip in his hand. It was a neurolash, a weapon designed to cause maximum pain without killing. Each strike would feel like fire and lightning burning through the nerves. It was meant to break spirits, not bodies. 20 lashes, Kraeth announced. His voice was calm, almost casual. For the crime of defiance. Let this be a lesson to all who would forget their place. The crowd was silent. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Then he opened them again and stared straight ahead at nothing. The first blow came without warning. Pain exploded across his back like someone had pressed a hot iron to his skin. Every nerve screamed. His muscles seized. But Daniel did not make a sound. He clenched his jaw so hard he thought his teeth might crack, and he held the scream inside. The second blow was worse. And the third. By the 5th strike, he could feel blood running down his back in warm rivers. By the 10th, his vision was starting to blur at the edges. On the platform, Draith and Korvax were keeping count out loud, laughing each time the whip fell. They made bets with each other about when Daniel would break. 5 more lashes, Draith said. 3, Korvax replied. Yanara had stopped looking at her claws. Even she seemed interested now, though her expression remained cold. But Veka did not laugh. She did not bet. She sat very still and watched with those strange, sharp eyes. Her small hands were folded in her lap, and her flopped ear twitched with each crack of the whip. 15, 16, 17. Daniel's knees buckled. He sagged against the chains, his full weight hanging from his wrists. The pain was beyond anything he had ever felt. It filled his entire world until there was nothing else. No thoughts. No memories. Just endless, burning agony. But still he did not scream. 18, 19. Torak paused before the final blow. He walked around to face Daniel, grabbing his hair and pulling his head up. Daniel's eyes were glazed, barely focused, but there was still something there. Something that refused to break. You are strong, Torak said quietly, so only Daniel could hear. I respect that. But strength means nothing here. You will learn. He walked back behind Daniel and raised the whip one final time. 20. The last blow was the hardest of all. Daniel's body jerked against the chains, and a sound finally escaped his lips. Not a scream. A grunt. A small, choked noise that was barely more than a breath, but that was all. Torak lowered the whip and stepped back. He looked at Kraeth and nodded. It is done, Overlord. Kraeth rose from his seat and looked down at Daniel with something that might have been interest. Impressive, he said. Most break by the 10th. Perhaps this one will be useful after all. He turned to his family. Come, dinner is waiting. The family stood and began to walk toward the main house. The slaves were dismissed to their quarters. The guards unchained Daniel and let him fall face first into the dirt. Everyone left. Almost everyone. Daniel lay in the courtyard, his cheek pressed against the cold ground, his back a ruined mess of torn flesh and blood. He could not move. He was not sure he wanted to. The pain was fading now, replaced by a strange numbness that felt almost peaceful. Then he heard footsteps. Small footsteps. Light and quick like a child. He forced his eyes open and saw a pair of small feet standing in front of him. He looked up, and there was Veka, the smallest cub, staring down at him with those strange amber eyes. She glanced over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Then she knelt down until her face was close to his. "Human," she whispered. Her voice was soft and high, like wind through leaves. "Can you hear me?" Daniel managed a small nod. "Good." She leaned even closer. "I counted them. The overseer who beat you. The guards who held you. The servants who laughed. My brothers who made their cruel jokes." Daniel stared at her, not understanding. "Tally your foes," she said. The words were strange coming from such a young mouth. They sounded old, ancient. Remember every face. Remember every wrong. That is what the old stories say. The ones my father has forbidden us to read. She paused and looked at him with an expression he could not read. There are stories about your kind, human. Stories from the old wars. Stories about what happens when humans are pushed too far. My father thinks they are just legends. My brothers think your species is weak. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees. But I have read the forbidden books. I have seen the records that were supposed to be destroyed. And I know the truth. Daniel found his voice. It was rough and broken, barely a whisper. What truth? Veka looked down at him one last time. The setting sun caught her eyes and made them glow like twin flames. That humans do not forget. And they do not forgive. Then she turned and walked away, her small form disappearing into the shadows of the estate. She moved like she had never been there at all. Like the whole conversation had been a dream. Daniel lay in the dirt for a long time after she left. The stars came out one by one above him. His back screamed with pain. His body begged for rest, but his mind was working. Tally your foes. Remember every face. Remember every wrong. He thought about Torek and his whip. He thought about Kraeth on his platform. He thought about the laughing sons and the bored daughter and the mate with her. Cold eyes. He thought about everyone who had hurt him. Everyone who had looked at him like he was less than nothing, and he began to count. 2 guards had dragged him from the fields. 6 guards had stood watch during the whipping. 1 overseer had swung the lash. 1 overlord had ordered it. 1 mate had smiled. 2 sons had laughed. 1 daughter had watched with empty eyes. 14 faces burned into his memory. It was not much. But it was a start. Daniel closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. But even in his pain, even on the edge of unconsciousness, he held on to those numbers. Tally your foes. He would remember. He would count. And when the time came, he would collect what was owed. The smallest cub had given him a gift. She did not know it yet, but she had given him something more valuable than food or medicine or comfort. She had given him purpose. The wounds on Daniel's back took 3 weeks to heal. During that time, he was put on light duty, which meant cleaning the stables and carrying water instead of working in the fields. It was still hard work, but it gave his body time to recover. More importantly, it gave him time to think. The other slaves avoided him at first. They thought he was crazy for standing up to Torek. They thought he had a death wish. But slowly, as the days passed and Daniel showed no signs of breaking, some of them began to look at him differently. There was curiosity in their eyes. And something else. Something that looked almost like hope. Daniel did not rush. He had learned patience in the academy back on Earth. He had learned it again in the long years of space exploration. And now he would learn it once more in the fields of VA or Ross-7. He watched. He listened. He remembered Torek checked on him every few days, looking for signs of defiance. Daniel gave him none. He worked hard. He kept his head down. He said yes and no and nothing more. After a month, Torek lost interest and moved on to other victims. That was when Daniel began to move. The estate of Overlord Kraeth was large, but it was not the only holding on Varos 7. There were 6 other estates on the moon, each owned by a different Valkorian noble, and each estate had slaves. Some of them were human. Daniel learned this from the supply runs. Every week, cargo ships came and went, bringing food and equipment and taking away the processed grain. The slaves who loaded and unloaded these ships sometimes talked to each other in whispered voices while the guards were not watching. That was how Daniel found her. Her name was Lisa Morrow. She had been an engineer aboard a cargo vessel that was captured by Valkorian raiders 8 years ago. Now she worked in the processing plant on the Verith estate, about 50 miles from where Daniel was held. She was smart, she was careful, and she had been waiting for someone like Daniel for a very long time. They communicated through coded messages scratched into grain crates. A mark here, a symbol there, things that looked like random scratches to anyone who did not know what to look for. It was slow work, but it was safe. Lisa told him about the other humans on the moon. There were 11 in total, scattered across 5 different estates. Some had been here for years. Some had given up hope entirely. But a few, a precious few, still had fire in their hearts. One of them was a man named Kevin Cole. He had been a Marine before his capture, trained in combat and survival. Now he worked in the mines on the northern edge of the moon, digging ore from the frozen ground. He was strong. He was angry. And he was ready to fight. Daniel began to build a network. It was dangerous work. If the Valkorians discovered what he was doing, they would not just kill him. They would make an example of him. They would torture him for days before finally letting him die. And they would do the same to everyone he had contacted. So Daniel was careful. He never wrote anything that could be traced back to him. He never spoke to anyone in public. He passed messages through trusted intermediaries, slaves who had proven themselves over months of careful testing, and through it all, he kept tallying his foes, the guards who patrolled the fields, the overseers who carried whips, the nobles who came to visit Kraith and looked at the slaves like they were furniture. Daniel remembered every face, every name, every cruelty large and small. His list grew longer every day. But something unexpected also happened during those months. The smallest cub came back. It was late one night, nearly 6 months after the whipping, when Daniel heard a soft tap on the window of the slave quarters. He was awake, as he often was, lying on his thin mat and staring at the ceiling. He rose quietly and moved to the window. Vecca was there, barely visible in the darkness. She had grown a little since he last saw her. Her flopped ear still drooped, and her eyes still held that strange sharpness that seemed too old for her young face. "Come," she whispered. Quietly. Daniel did not hesitate. He slipped out through a loose board in the wall that he had discovered weeks ago and followed her into the shadows. She led him to a small storage building behind the main house. It was used for keeping old furniture and broken equipment, things that no one cared about. Inside, she had set up a small space with a lamp and a pile of cushions. "Why are you helping me?" Daniel asked. It was the question that had been burning in his mind for months. Vecca sat down and looked at him. In the soft light of the lamp, she looked almost fragile. But there was nothing fragile about her voice when she spoke. "My father is cruel," she said. "My brothers are cruel. My sister cares only for herself. My mother cares only for status. I have watched them hurt others my whole life. I have watched them break people who did nothing wrong." She paused and picked at the edge of a cushion. "I am small and weak. I am the runt. My family does not notice me most of the time. They think I am too stupid to understand what they do. But I understand. I understand everything." "That does not answer my question," Daniel said gently. Vecca looked up at him. "I told you about the Forbidden Histories. The books my father keeps locked away. I found the key when I was 3 cycles old. I have been reading them ever since. What do they say? They say that humans are different from other species. They say that humans hold grudges longer than any other beings in the galaxy. They say that when humans are wronged, they do not just seek revenge. They seek complete victory. Total destruction of those who hurt them." She leaned forward. "There was a Valkorian colony in the Arcturus sector 200 years ago. They captured a human ship and enslaved the crew. They thought humans were weak. They thought humans would break like all the others. What happened? The humans escaped. It took them 11 years, but they escaped. And when they did not just leave. They came back with more humans. with ships and weapons and the cold fury of a species that had been wronged. Vika's voice dropped to a whisper. They burned the colony to the ground. Every building, every ship, every Valkorian who had participated in the slave trade. Nothing was left. Not even ruins. The humans were thorough. Daniel said nothing. He had heard stories like this before. They were part of human history. Part of what made his species both admired and feared throughout the galaxy. My father thinks those stories are exaggerated, Vika continued. He thinks humans have grown soft. He thinks you are no different from the Chitauri or the Drenathi or any other conquered species. She met his eyes. But I have watched you. I watched you take a whip meant for someone else. I watched you refuse to scream even when your back was torn apart. I watched you walk back to work the next week like nothing had happened. And I know the truth. What truth? You are counting. You are planning. You are waiting. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. This child, this small and overlooked cub, had seen right through him. Why tell me this? He asked. Why help me instead of turning me in? Vika stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the estate, at the towers and walls and fields that represented her family's power. Because I do not want to be like them, she said quietly. Because when the counting is done and the tally is complete, I do not want to be on the wrong side of the ledger. She turned back to face him. I will help you. I will bring you food when you are hungry. Medicine when you are hurt. Information about my father's business, his guards, his weaknesses. In return, when the time comes, you will remember that I chose differently. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. She was 6 cycles old, a child by any measure, but she spoke like someone who had already seen too much of the world's darkness. Why should I trust you? He asked. Vika smiled. It was a sad smile, full of knowledge that no child should have. Because I am small and weak, she said. And small and weak things must be smart or they do not survive? You understand this. He did. Daniel reached out and took her small hand in his. It was a gesture of acceptance. A contract sealed without words. I will remember, he said. When the tally is complete, I will remember that you chose differently. Vika nodded. Then she slipped out into the night, disappearing as quietly as she had come. Daniel stayed in the storage building for a while longer, thinking about what she had said. The child was right. He was counting. He was planning. He was waiting, but now he was not alone. He had allies among the other slaves. He had a network spreading across the moon. And he had a spy in the heart of his enemy's household. The tally was growing. The plan was taking shape, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a clock was ticking. The Valkorians had made a mistake when they whipped him in front of that little cub. They had thought it would teach her to be cruel like them. Instead, it had taught her to be something else entirely. It had taught her to choose, and she had chosen humanity. 2 years. That was how long it took. 2 years of watching and waiting. 2 years of counting guards and mapping patrol routes. 2 years of whispering messages through the network and gathering supplies one piece at a time. 2 years of healing wounds during the day and planning revolution at night. Daniel Hayes had become something different in those 2 years. The man who had knelt in the slave market was gone. In his place stood someone harder, sharper, more patient than he had ever been before, and he was not alone. Across Veros, 11 humans had joined his cause. Lisa Morrow had turned half the workers in the processing plant into silent allies. Kevin Cole had organized the miners into a fighting force that trained in secret, deep in the tunnels where no guards ever went. Others had done their part, each according to their skills and positions, but humans were not the only ones, ready to fight. The Chitauri remembered the whipping. They remembered Daniel stepping between the old woman and the lash. Word had spread through their community like fire through dry grass. When Daniel asked for their help, they gave it without hesitation. The Drenathi were more cautious, but they too had suffered under Valkorian cruelty. Their elders met in secret with Daniel's representatives and agreed to support the uprising when the time came. Even some Valkorians had joined. Those few who had been cast out by their own kind for showing mercy to slaves or questioning the old ways. They were few in number, but their knowledge of Valkorian tactics and technology was priceless. And through it all, Vika continued to help. She was 8 cycles old now, still small, still overlooked. But she had become Daniel's most valuable source of information. She told him about her father's political enemies, about the tensions between the great houses, about the shipments of weapons that passed through the estate. She stole keys and copied documents and listened at doors where no one thought to look for spies. The plan was complex, but its core was simple. Wait for the right moment. Strike hard. Strike fast. Give the enemy no time to respond. That moment came on the night of red moons. Varos 7 had 3 small moons that orbited in complex patterns. Once every local year, all 3 aligned in a configuration that turned the night sky crimson. The Valkorians celebrated this event with feasts and ceremonies that dated back thousands of years. Every noble house held grand parties. Every guard drank deep. Every overseer let their attention slip. It was the one night of the year when the masters let down their guard. Daniel had been planning for this night since the moment he learned about it. Every detail was prepared. Every piece was in place. All that remained was to set it in motion. At midnight, when the sky was red as blood and the sounds of celebration echoed across the estate, Daniel gave the signal. It began in the mines. Kevin Cole led 30 former slaves through tunnels. They had been digging in secret for months. They emerged inside the armory of the Verith estate, catching the 2 guards on duty completely by surprise. In less than 5 minutes, the rebels had weapons in their hands for the first time in years. Lisa Morrow was next. She and her team disabled the communication arrays at the processing plant, cutting off the entire moon from outside contact. No distress calls would be sent. No reinforcements would come. Then the real fighting began. Daniel himself led the assault on Kraith's estate. He had 50 fighters at his back, humans and Chitauri and Dranathi, and even a handful of Valkorian defectors. They moved through the shadows like ghosts, taking out guards one by one with weapons. They had stolen and hidden over months of careful preparation. The Valkorians were drunk and unprepared. They had grown soft in their certainty that slaves would never dare to rise against them. That certainty cost them dearly. By 1 in the morning, the outer walls were secure. By 2, the guard barracks had fallen. By 3, Daniel stood at the doors of the main house, with blood on his hands and fire in his eyes. "Open it," he said. 2. Chitauri workers who had served in the house for decades stepped forward with keys they had copied long ago. The locks clicked open one by one. Daniel walked into Overlord Kraith's home as a conqueror. He found Torak in the Great Hall, trying to organize a defense with whatever guards remained sober. The massive overseer saw Daniel and let out a roar of rage, charging forward with a blade in his hand. Daniel did not move. He simply raised the weapon he had taken from a dead guard and fired. Torak fell to the ground with a smoking hole in his chest. He looked up at Daniel with disbelief in his eyes. "You," he gasped. "You were broken." "I broke you myself." Daniel knelt beside him. "You thought you did? But you never understood what we are. Humans do not break. We bend, we wait. We remember. And when the time is right, we rise." Torak's eyes went dark. Daniel stood up and stepped over the body. There was more work to do. Kraith had barricaded himself in his private chambers with his family and a handful of loyal guards. It took an hour to break down the reinforced doors. When they finally gave way, Daniel walked into the room alone. Kraith stood in the center of the chamber with a plasma pistol in his hand. His mate Seleth cowered behind him, and his 4 cubs clustered against the far wall. The old overlord's fur was disheveled, his eyes wild. "Stay back," he snarled. "I am Overlord Kraith of House Verith. I rule this moon. You are nothing. You are property." Daniel smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "I was property," he said. 2 years ago you had me whipped in that courtyard. 20 lashes for the crime of showing mercy to an old woman. Do you remember?" Kraith's pistol wavered. "That was discipline. That was how things are done." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "That is how things were done." But things have changed. He took a step forward. Kraith pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The weapon's power cell had been drained. Vika had done that 3 days ago, switching out the charged cells for empty ones while the guards were at dinner. Kraith stared at the useless weapon in his hand, then threw it aside and lunged at Daniel with his bare claws. He was fast for his age, but Daniel was ready. He sidestepped the attack and drove his elbow into Kraith's temple. The Overlord stumbled, and Daniel followed up with a kick that sent him crashing to the floor. It was over in seconds. The mighty Overlord Kraith, who had ruled this moon for 50 years, lay groaning in the dirt at the feet of a former slave. By dawn, the entire estate was under rebel control. They brought Kraith's family to the courtyard. The same courtyard where Daniel had been whipped 2 years before. The same metal post still stood there, dark with old stains. Hundreds of freed slaves gathered to watch. Humans, Chitauri, Dranathi, and others who had suffered under Valkorian rule. They looked at the captured nobles with eyes full of anger and pain and long-delayed justice. Daniel stood before the prisoners and raised his hand for silence. "We have won this night," he said. "But victory is not the same as vengeance. We are not like them. We will not become the monsters we have defeated." He pointed at Salaf and 3 of the cubs, Draith and Korvax and Yanara. "These 4 will stand trial before a council of their victims. They will answer for their crimes. They will face justice, but it will be true justice, not cruelty dressed in its clothing." The crowd murmured. Some agreed. Some did not. Many had suffered too much to want anything less than blood. Then someone shouted from the back, "What about the small one? The runt?" Daniel looked at Veka. She stood apart from her family, her small form trembling slightly. Her siblings had pushed her away the moment the rebels entered, as if hoping she might be overlooked. "This one is under my protection," Daniel said. The crowd erupted. Angry voices called out demands for revenge against all of Kraith's bloodline. Daniel raised his hand again. "Listen to me," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This child is 6 cycles old. While her family was learning cruelty, she was learning kindness. While her brothers laughed at our pain, she wept for us in secret. While we suffered, she risked her own life to help us." He walked to where Vika stood and placed his hand on her shoulder. "The night I was whipped, she came to me in the dirt. She told me to tally my foes, to remember every wrong. That advice kept me alive. It gave me purpose when I had none." He looked out at the crowd. "She brought us food when we were starving, medicine when we were sick, information that made tonight possible. Without her, we would all still be in chains." The crowd was silent now. Some faces showed doubt. Others showed understanding. "I will not punish a child for the sins of her parents," Daniel continued. "She made a choice that no one in her family had the courage to make. She chose to be different. She chose to be better." He knelt down to meet Vika's eyes. Tears were running down her small face, matting the fur on her cheeks. "You helped us," he said softly. "Now we will help you. You will have a place among us if you want it." Vika's voice was barely a whisper. "Why? Why would you help me?" "I am Valkorian." Daniel stood up and looked down at her with something like warmth in his eyes. "Because that is what humans do. We remember our enemies. But we also remember our friends." He turned to address the crowd one final time. "Tonight we have torn down a system of cruelty that lasted for centuries. Tomorrow we will build something new, something better. And it will start here with this child who had the courage to choose differently." The sun rose over Varro 7, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. For the first time in decades, 5 years had passed since the Night of Red Moons. The moon called Varro 7 was a different place now. The slave quarters had been torn down and replaced with proper housing. The whipping posts in every courtyard had been melted into scrap. The great estates that once belonged to cruel overlords now served as schools, hospitals, and community centers. It had not been easy. The first year after the uprising was chaos. Valkorian warships had come from the nearest sector to crush the rebellion, but they found something unexpected waiting for them. The freed slaves had captured the planetary defense systems and turned them against their former masters. More importantly, they had sent word to the Earth Coalition, and human ships had arrived just in time to tip the balance. The Battle of Varo 7 lasted 3 weeks. When it was over, the Valkorian fleet had retreated, and the moon had been declared a free territory under the protection of the Coalition. Now, 5 years later, Varo 7 was thriving. The fields still grew purple grain, but the workers who harvested it were paid fair wages and went home to families who loved them. Humans, Chitauri, Dranathi, and even some Valkorians lived side by side, building something that had never existed before in this part of the galaxy. A place where species did not matter, where the past did not define the future. Daniel Hayes stood on the balcony of what had once been Kraith's manor, watching transport ships descend through the purple sky. Diplomatic vessels. Trade ships? And today, something special. A shuttle bearing the flag of the Earth Coalition. He was not young anymore. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and the scars on his back ached when the weather changed. But his eyes were still sharp, and his spirit was unbroken. "They are almost here," said a voice behind him. Daniel turned and smiled. Vika stood in the doorway, no longer the small cub he had first met in the courtyard. She had grown tall over the past 5 years, though she was still shorter than most of her kind. Her fur had lightened to a soft silver, and her flopped ears still drooped in that distinctive way. She wore the simple clothes of the free people of Varo 7, and on her chest was pinned a small badge that marked her as a member of the governing council. "You look nervous," Daniel said. "I am not nervous," Veka replied, though her ears twitched in a way that said otherwise. "I am simply aware that this meeting will shape the future of our world. That is one way to describe nervousness." Veka made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You know me too well." They walked together through the manor, past rooms that had once held prisoners and were now filled with the sounds of children playing and teachers lecturing. The building had been transformed from a symbol of oppression into a symbol of hope. The shuttle landed in the courtyard as they arrived. Daniel felt a strange twist in his chest as he looked at the metal post that had once stood in the center of this space. It was gone now, replaced by a simple stone monument listing the names of all who had died during the years of slavery. Thousands of names in dozens of languages. A delegation emerged from the shuttle. Men and women in coalition uniforms, diplomats, and officials who had come to formalize the relationship between Earth and Varo 7. At their head was an older woman with steel-gray hair and a face that had seen many battles, Admiral Catherine. Hayes, Daniel's mother, she had thought, him dead for nearly 8 years. When word of the uprising reached Earth, she had led the fleet that came to help. Their reunion had been one of the happiest moments of Daniel's life. Now, she walked toward him with a smile on her face and pride in her eyes. "Commander Hayes," she said formally, using his old title. "It is good to see you again." "Admiral," Daniel replied with equal formality. Then he dropped the act and embraced her. "Hello, Mom." Catherine laughed and hugged him back. "You look tired. Are they working you too hard on this council of yours? Someone has to keep things running." They separated, and Catherine looked around the courtyard. Her eyes lingered on the monument, on the names carved in stone. Her expression grew serious. "I read the reports," she said quietly, "about what they did to you, about what they did to all of you. It was a long time ago. That does not make it hurt less." Daniel shook his head. "No, but it makes the victory sweeter." He gestured to Vika, who had been standing quietly to the side. "Mother, I would like you to meet someone. This is Vika. She is our primary liaison to the Valkorian reform movement and one of the finest people I have ever known." Catherine looked at the young Valkorian with careful eyes. She knew the stories. Everyone did. The runt cub who had helped the slaves, the child who had chosen differently. "So you are the one who told my son to tally his foes," Catherine said. Veka dipped her head in a gesture of respect. "I am, Admiral. Though I was very young at the time. You saved his life. You saved all of their lives. I did what I thought was right. Nothing more." Catherine studied her for a long moment, then smiled. It was the same smile Daniel remembered from his childhood, warm and genuine. "That is exactly what makes you remarkable," she said. "Welcome to the family." Vika's ears lifted in surprise. Before she could respond, Catherine turned and began walking toward the manor. Already discussing diplomatic protocols with her aides. Daniel and Vika followed at a slower pace. "Your mother is very direct," Vika observed. "She is a Hayes. We are all direct." "I have noticed." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Vika spoke again, more quietly this time. "The tribunal finished their deliberations this morning. My mother will serve another 15 years in the labor rehabilitation program. My siblings will serve 20 each. They are not happy with the verdict." Daniel looked at her. "Are you?" Vika considered the question carefully before answering. "I am at peace. They were given mercy they never showed to others. True justice, as you promised 5 years ago. Perhaps one day they will understand why. And if they do not, then that is their choice. We cannot force people to become better. We can only give them the chance." Daniel nodded. It was one of the hardest lessons he had learned in the years since the uprising. Revenge was easy. Justice was hard. Mercy was harder still. But they were building something new here, something that had to be better than what came before. That meant giving even their worst enemies the chance to change. Even if most of them did not take it, they reached the main hall, where the delegation was being welcomed with food and drink. Daniel was about to join them when Vika put a hand on his arm. "I have been meaning to ask you something," she said. "For a long time now. What is it?" Vika looked at him with those amber eyes that had seen so much pain and yet still held so much hope. "That night in the courtyard, when I told you to tally your foes, you were half dead. You could barely hear me. Why did you listen? Why did those words matter so much?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, remembering. The blood and the pain, the cold dirt against his cheek, the small voice in the darkness, giving him something to hold on to. "Because in that moment I had nothing," he finally said. "No hope. No future. No reason to keep fighting. And then this tiny cub came out of nowhere and reminded me of who I was. What I was capable of." He turned to face her fully. "You did not just give me advice, Veka. You gave me a reason to live. You reminded me that even in the darkest places, even among the cruelest people, there are those who choose differently. And those are the ones worth fighting for." Vika's ears flattened in the Valkorian expression of deep emotion. "You are being sentimental. I am being human." She made that sound again, the one that was almost a laugh. "Yes, you are very good at that." Daniel smiled and put his arm around her shoulders. "Come on, we have diplomats to impress and treaties to sign. The work of building a better future waits for no one." They walked into the hall together, the human and the Valkorian, the former slave and the former noble. Around them, beings of a dozen different species talked and laughed and argued about politics and trade and the thousand small details that made civilization possible outside. The sky of Varos 7 was turning purple with the coming dusk. Ships came and went, carrying goods and people and ideas to every corner of the galaxy. The monument in the courtyard stood silent guard over the memories of those who had not lived to see this day, and somewhere in the archives of the Coalition, in a file that very few people had access to, there was a document called the Tally of Varos 7. It listed every wrong that had been done during the years of slavery. Every whipping, every death, every cruelty large and small, most of those debts had been paid now. The overlords had faced justice. The system had been destroyed. The survivors had built new lives, but the document remained. A reminder of what had happened. A warning of what could happen again if people forgot. Daniel Hayes had kept that list for 5 years. He had crossed off names as trials were held and sentences were served. Now, at last, the list was almost empty. The tally was complete. But the story, as he had learned long ago, was only beginning. There would be new challenges, new enemies, new injustices to fight, and new wrongs to right. The universe was vast and full of beings who had not yet learned that humans were not to be pushed too far, but that was a problem for another day. Tonight. There was peace. There was hope. There was a future worth building. And there was a small Valkorian with a flopped ear who had taught him the most important lesson of all.